It's great to welcome Lad Everitt back to the program. He's Director of Communications for the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. He's joined us a number of times before. Lad, we keep hearing more and more about this idea that the way to stop a so-called bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And this has been applied to a number of different scenarios. And when I think about it, there's sort of two analyses that I see. One is the common sense analysis, which is in a situation where you start hearing shots fired, it's very difficult practically if you have a gun to know exactly who the bad guy is and to know exactly where to start shooting. And the Aurora movie theater shooting for me is the sort of obvious example of that. So let's start there. What sort of common sense analysis can we apply to this idea?
Well, I think the interesting thing here is that this recent tragedy at Umpqua Community College, we were able to confirm actually that there were concealed handgun permit holders on that campus that day.
Right.
MSNBC interviewed one of these gentlemen, John Parker Jr., the day after the shooting, or maybe even immediately after the shooting, and he indicated that he and some fellow veterans were in a classroom, not in the classroom at Snyder Hall, but in a classroom very close to the scene of the shooting. They were armed. They had their concealed handgun permits. They had a quick discussion about whether they should try to intervene. And according to Parker, they decided against it because they were worried that responding SWAT officers would see them with their guns drawn and kill them. So, there's a couple of hurdles here. One is the one that you suggested, which is that if we go back to the Aurora Theater shooting, when you're in a dark theater with smoke grenades going off, and you have, let's say, multiple people brandish firearms. Let's say one of them is the mass shooter, and you have maybe two or three other guys who brandish guns to be "quote unquote" good guys. It becomes very difficult in, let's say, the fog of war in that moment to really divine who one should be shooting at. And obviously, when you have a panic situation like that, which you would have in a theater or a classroom, I mean, you're going to have people running for their lives. The odds of getting a perfectly clear shot at the shooter where you're not going to do collateral damage is slim to none, I would think.
So that's the sort of common sense analysis to the idea of more people starting to fire guns when a bad guy with a gun is identified or presumed to exist. Let's now look at the data. What do we know about situations? What data do we have about these situations that might give us some additional insight into the sort of validity or facility with which a good guy with a gun could act as such?
Well, I think we need to step back even further than that. I think the first thing that people need to realize is that most of these mass shooters, technically under the NRA's definition, are good guys with a gun. We need to understand that in the majority of mass shootings, you have shooters that have clearly definable mental health history and violent history, sometimes criminal history as well. And yet, in the majority of cases, they legally purchase guns. They're able to pass background checks. So I would start off by saying that, number one, the whole concept of good guy with a gun, that might mean something in a country like Britain, let's say, that has a modern system of firearms regulation, and someone with violent history couldn't legally buy a gun. It might mean something there. In this country, it doesn't mean much because, for example, you could have a rap sheet a mile long with violent misdemeanor convictions for assault and battery and legally buy a gun. If you're not under an active restraining order, but you've been under 8 or 9 prior restraining orders for beating up women, you're a legal purchaser. You're a good guy with a gun. And so on and so on and so on.
So is it fair to say that based on current gun safety regulations, it's already possible for the bad guys with guns to get guns?
In many cases, let's be perfectly clear. In many cases, these mass shooters are, according to the NRA definition, law-abiding citizens, quote unquote, and good guys with a gun. These are guys that legally passed the hurdles, passed a background check, and got those guns through a legal process. And again, that's a comment on just how insane our laws are. And these aren't people where, this was close calls, where, no one could have seen this coming. I mean, these are guys like Jared Loeffner, James Holmes, Sung Hee Cho. I mean, these are guys that were screaming to the entire world, "I'm dangerous." So the whole concept is flawed to begin with. I mean, if you're, for example, if you're in a state like, set Tennessee or a shell issue state or even a constitutional carry state, God forbid, and something goes wrong and you see guys brandish guns and stand up, you have no idea what the background of these guys are. The guy, quote unquote, trying to protect you might be a worse bad guy with a gun than the bad guy with a gun. It's a meaningless term. It's a term the NRA uses to try to, I think, make a world that's very much in shades of gray into plain black and white. And it's just not that simple. And the NRA understands this because, of course, they are the force that is pushed to allow bad guys with a gun to legally buy firearms.
So then, granted all of that, let's now go into maybe not good guy with a gun per se, because it's such a sort of amorphous and meaningless term, as you've pointed out, but what do we know, what data do we have about individuals legally carrying guns stopping active shooters?
Well, it's never happened. I mean, I'm not aware of any mass shooting incidents, where a concealed handgun permit holder or someone legally carrying has stopped an incident. There's been some, I think, close calls. There are some shootings they cite where, there was a person with a gun that was close to the scene. There's a few shootings where people who were, like, for example, armed security guards or off-duty cops were able to intervene in a manner that was effective.
Right.
But, in a majority of these situations, shooters are not shot. They're tackled or, they're physically restrained by people at the scene without further loss of life.
Now, the pro-gun advocates would say, well, lad, the problem is a lot of these shootings, and you know where I'm going to go with this, are happening in so-called gun-free zones. So, of course, the law-abiding good guys with guns follow the law and don't bring their guns, and thus the bad guys with guns take advantage of such a gun-free zone in order to commit one of these shootings.
Right. Well, the Umpqua Community College shooting ended that debate. It occurred in a gun-full zone because Oregon, again, because of the NRA, because of the gun lobby in that state, passed legislation allowing gun carrying on campuses. It was challenged legally by the universities there. They failed. And only retained very limited ability to regulate it. So to be perfectly clear, students at Umpqua Community College were and are able to carry guns on campus, and many of them, according to the testimony of this John Parker Jr., were carrying that day, including several individuals just in his classroom, which begs the question, campus-wide, how many people were packing guns that day? Probably a very significant number. So Umpqua kind of put an end to that debate. The shooter there, Chris Harper Mercer, was not deterred by the fact that the college campus allowed gun carrying. There very well might have been people carrying guns in that classroom that we're not aware of. It certainly would have been possible. They all had the opportunity to. I think pretty much Umpqua puts an end to that debate.
All right. And as usual, the background of this is how easy it is to obtain a gun in the United States, as Lad Everitt points out to us. Lad Everitt is the Director of Communications for the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. Lad, thanks as always for joining us.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, David, for having me on.